Welcome to the live stream Q&A. If you have any writing or storytelling questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, and I look forward to getting to them today. And if you just want to hang out and listen to the answers, feel free to do so. Happy to have you. Is it a problem to think your story is taking too much inspiration from another? Taking inspiration from other stories, I think, is totally fine. In fact, it's a good thing. None of us are fully original. We're always taking in inspirations from other places. And so if you're looking at your story and you think to yourself, it is taking too much from this particular source, the solution isn't necessarily to just stop taking in inspiration. In fact, the best solution is to start taking inspiration from other places so that you get a collection of inspirations that help make it more original. Because originality is taking disparate inspirations that have not been combined before and combining them in a fresh way. And so if you have a story and you think it's being too derivative of something else, the best solution is probably not going to be just sitting there spinning your wheels how to differentiate it. Instead, think to yourself, what are some other stories I love? And what do I love about them that I can bring in here to make it feel new, make it feel fresh, make it feel more differentiated? Because if you mix enough things in the pot, it's the end dish is going to taste a lot different than if you just took, chicken stock and some chicken breast in there. So the more ingredients you can put in, the more unique and original it's going to taste. How can I make my character's first kiss scene impactful? Make it meaningful. Make it long awaited. Make it like a moment for the character where maybe they've been wanting love for so long and they've been broken for so long. And this is a moment where they feel relief, release, and comfort, perhaps. So if you can tie it in with a good big character emotional moment, internally for their character journey, that can also really make an impact. What do you do when you consider your writing style, the style, not the story, too bad and get demoralized? Writing style, I think, is something we have a lot of misconceptions about. People tend to think of your writing style as like your unique voice, the unique piece of you that you bring out into the world and onto the page. And when you're trying to develop your style, all you're trying to do is bring that part of you out and onto the page. But that's not what style and voice actually are, because it doesn't pre-exist in us. It needs to come out. Instead, we need to create it by taking in a bunch of different influences, trying on a bunch of different stylistic hats as we pursue authors we love, whether you love Margaret Atwood, Stephen King, Neil Gaiman, or anyone. And so when you pursue styles of writing over time, you'll try on different hats, you'll try on different styles, and you'll discard pieces, but then hold on to some of them as you go. And then what happens is you end up with your own kind of unique wardrobe, if you will, over time. Because I've emulated a bunch of different writers over the years, whether it was when I was younger, it was like J.K. Rowling, it was Christopher Paolini when I was in 7th grade, Orson Scott Card, Ted Dekker, Stephen King, Nancy Farmer, Ursula K. Le Guin, and I'm always pursuing a little bit them at different times. And at times I might be an Orson Scott Card ripoff when I was in first year of college. I was very much miming him. Then I was kind of a bit of a Raymond Carver kind of ripoff. And what's happening though is I was trying on those hats because that was an aesthetic I liked and I wanted to pursue it. But yeah, over time though, I kept shifting away, but then eventually I started to kind of center around what my own kind of unique traits are. And it's a combination of all these different influences I've had. And it continues to even slightly shift depending on what I'm trying to write. And so that's where where your own personal style actually comes from, is over time trying different things, bringing in your own unique combination of influences and combining that with who you are and who you uniquely are. And so if you're not satisfied with your writing style, what I would recommend you do is look at writers you love. Look at the writers that inspire you, that you do want to be like, and don't be afraid to try on that hat. Don't be afraid to try and write once again, Stephen King if you love them, or whoever it may be. And for a while, you're going to have your work look a lot like them. It's going to be slightly derivative. But what's going to happen is eventually you're going to see another author you love, and you're going to try some stuff from them. And each time you make that little lily pad hop from writer to writer inspiration, you will start to create something more uniquely your own. And so if you're dissatisfied with your style, I would just encourage you to keep pursuing the development of your style by bringing inspirations that excite you. And understanding that the goal is never to perfectly mimic these other writers, but to simply pursue the parts of them that you love and make them your own. So basically and you can also target basically the things of your writing style you don't love. Just to give you a more tangible example of this, I some things that I realized in college was I was writing very literal, uh, short, tight sentences. My language is very literal and tight, and it was very crisp, and it was good. But I read some writers like Colin McCann and Marcus Zusak who had just a wonderful way with figurative language, and I realized how dull and literal my writing was. And so what I did was I started pursuing that. I started practicing similes and metaphors, and I did exercises, and I consciously try to work it into my writing, and so now I have brought that into my style. It's a very common thing I do now. Or another thing is I felt like my writing was too stiff. And so I looked at Stephen King and I was like, I love his very conversational writing style, which is very saturated with the character's perspective despite being in the third person. And so I kind of pursued that a little bit. And what's done is I've not become a mimic of Stephen King, but it's loosened up my writing in a way that I've really come to love. And so keep seeking inspiration. Look at other writers and see what you want in your style and pursue it. Look at them, read their work, and pursue it and emulate it and start to build the style that you want. Hope that's helpful. Any tips on how to make traveling-based books interesting? It's specific, but I hear they risk being boring. So like there's a lot of travel going on in your story. I would say you just need to think about conflict. Conflict is what makes a story interesting. And so while they're traveling, you need to introduce conflict, whether it's conflict between two characters, whether it's something they come upon on the road or in their travels, barriers to overcome, people to overcome, landscapes and geographical challenges. And so you need to find conflict and tension on the trip. And if you think of it that way, it actually is not unlike many other types of stories. It's literally just your characters are continuously moving from point A to point Z, and along the way, you just need to incorporate conflict, just like you would if they were staying in one city. So focus on finding conflicts on the road for them to face and overcome and deal with. Do you have any tips on outlining your stories and on writing a first draft? Yeah, so some advice for outlining your story is, first of all, I want you to know that there is no one right way to outline a story. An outline is only as useful as you make it to yourself. Like, some people don't like to use outlines at all. Some people like to use very detailed outlines, and everything in between is also acceptable. So for example, for me, my outlines are just the major plot points of the story, and then I only really focus on those big beats. I only really put the big beats into my outlines because what I like to do is I like to improvise between those beats. And so that's what works best for me. But someone else might want a more detailed outline. Someone else might want little to no outline, and that's all totally okay. So that first piece of advice I want to give you with outlining is there is no right way. It's just whatever way happens to work best for you. So try some different things out. Like, if you feel like a really detailed outline is what you need to do, go for it. I used to do those for a while. I stopped doing them because I realized my characters in my story never wanted to follow it. It always was better for me to just leave some things up in the air. So that's why I moved away from that. But give that a shot. If that doesn't work, try having an outline with less in there. Try writing some stories with no outline at all and see where they take you. See if you like that process. And so that's some advice I have for outlining and figuring out what kind of outline works well for you. How can I describe smell? When I'm trying to describe smells, I often just look up ideas of what something smells like. Like, for example, if you want to describe the smell of gasoline, Google, what does gasoline smell like? Because I have a bad sense of smell, and so I'm not very good at picking out like the unique aspects of it. So you can find online other descriptions and words to use to help describe what that smells like. And so Google is a helpful tool for that. Is there a way to know if your story is any good? Not objectively, no. Every story is a bit of a leap of faith. Your best indicator will be if you are excited by it. And if you are excited by it, then odds are someone else could also be excited by it. Now, will the people who find it really good and who really enjoy it, will that be 10 people, 100 people, 100,000 people? You'll never know until you send it out there and see. It's always going to be a bit of a leap of faith. It's always going to be a bit of a roll of the dice, if you will. But the best place to start is, do you love this story? Does it excite you? And if so, someone or some group of people out there will probably feel the same way. How do you know if your plot line is actually good or just really derivative? That is my biggest worry. Well, what I would say is a plot line isn't necessarily good or bad based on how derivative it is. Like, just because a plot is somewhat familiar doesn't mean it can't also be good. because a lot of stories have very similar plot lines and can be kind of predictable to an extent, but people still love them and they're still very impactful stories. So what really matters is more the characters you put in that plot. So if you're worried about the quality of your work, I would say focus more on your characters themselves, because two things can happen when you do that. One, they become very real people to the readers and they can love the characters even if it is a familiar plot. But then the other thing you can do is if you really understand your characters and they have a core emotional drive that you understand, a core belief, desire, insecurity, emotion that really drives a lot of their actions. If you understand that, what you can do is use the characters to drive the plot forward. The character can act on their inmost emotions. They can act upon their inmost emotions. That action can have consequences, and then that in turn can direct the plot in different directions. And so if you're always following your characters, if you take the time to develop your characters and then follow those characters, you'll often find your story going in less derivative ways. So that's what I would say is, first of all, once again, a slightly derivative plot is not inherently a deal breaker, but if you want to avoid that a little bit, I would say best place to focus is the characters, because the characters are what sell a story anyway, and they're also the thing that can really help make your plot more original anyway. So focus on your characters. What's the best way to deliver exposition for your characters as well as your world? As the things become relevant. So if you just give exposition of random things that aren't relevant to the situation or have no triggers in the scene, for example, if your character is walking through the church they went to when they were younger, and that triggers memories of the church and information about the church all in the exposition, that's fine because they're there and there was a bit of a trigger. It makes sense. But if your character is at home and they just randomly think of the church and we get that exposition there it just doesn't feel relevant. And so that's where it can feel really info dumpy. So what's good is to spread out a lot of the information of your world and your characters to moments as it becomes relevant, and as there are triggers in the scene to make them think about it. So how do I give my characters a unique voice? When looking at characters and trying to give them a voice, one thing I think is kind of helpful is if you start with big blocks of like what a voice can be, and then kind of narrow down with adjectives. So for example, you might have one character who you start off with, I want them to be a bit of a jokester. And you're like, okay, so their tone of voice is more of a jokester. What kind of a jokester? Like, are they self-deprecating? Are they a little vindictive, a little edgy? And you start just adding little descriptors that kind of help add on to the voice. Likewise, if you have someone who's soft-spoken, it's like, oh, okay, they're soft-spoken. What else? The words they use, maybe they speak with a lot of compassion, or maybe they speak with a little bitterness, because you can be soft-spoken, but still be a little bitter and biting with your words. Maybe they have a biting sense of humor as well with their soft-spokenness, but then someone else just might be very kind and loving with it. And so it's just a matter of start with a big block and then ask yourself some follow-up questions to really add nuance to what their voice looks like. So that's how you can do it if you want to just kind of construct it. I personally like to start off by just writing and seeing what comes out of the character's mouth when I first start. That's where I lean more into a pantser area, and then I kind of refine it in revision. But that's a good technique if you want to kind of plan it. How do you make a good mentor-mentee role without focusing on the mentor too much? I would say, just like with many types of relationships between characters, I think you need to ask yourself, what type of growth is their relationship going to promote? How is the mentor going to help the mentee grow in some shape or form, or deal with whatever conflict they're dealing with within themselves? And the better you can define that, the better you can use that as kind of a guide for how their relationship should progress. Because if they can challenge and grow each other, that can be a very fruitful mentor-mentee relationship. That's true for a lot of character relationships, but that's what I would say off the cuff. Biggest mistakes you've seen new writers make? The biggest mistakes I see new writers make tend to be they lean too hard into they want to get it done in a single draft, and they don't lean into the revision process. And that is something that, like, my wife teaches college writing. I taught college writing for 2 semesters when I was getting my MFA. And that's something you see in general across writers from a low level of experience to high level experience, is the more experience they have, the more comfortable they are with revising, because they really understand that revision is where a lot of the magic happens in writing. And they really understand that first draft doesn't need to be perfect. The first draft can be messy. And so I think the mistake a lot of beginner writers make is they try to make it good in the first go. And so what's really important to understand is every story is going to take at least first draft minimum on your own, which you revise to make a second draft. And then you'll show it to people, so you have to make a third draft. And that's the bare minimum. And that's not even with polishing at the end. And so you probably need 3 to 5 drafts minimum per story. Some people do more. Like you cut it off where you want to, but revision is where writing happens. And writing is revising. Like it is. So that's something I think important for new writers to understand. The only other thing I would say that a lot of new writers, well, I say new writers, but truthfully, a lot of writers do, is they over-focus on what's wrong with their story rather than what's working, and they get really demoralized. And so whenever you're looking at your story, or anyone's story, truthfully, because it's good to practice this, don't just look at what's wrong, look at what's going right, and even little bits of potential what could have gone better. Because what that does is you get a more holistic understanding of that story and your own work. And so like, because if you only ever learn to look at what's going wrong in your story, and you start writing, and all you're going to see is what's wrong with it. If you can't see what's good, you're not going to feel as much motivation. So I'm going to hop off now. Thank you all so much for coming to this week's live stream. I hope to do this again next week. So check my bio for the next time, for the next one. It should be next week, Saturday, I think at 2 p.m. Central Time. That's what it's generally been.